Good morning. My name is Paula Coomer. I'm talking to you from my temporary housing in Garfield, Washington. My husband and I have been for the last year and a half working on building a house, and so what you see behind me is a kind of little tiny apartment place we've rented, and we'll see how this works this morning. As with many folks, I'm kind of learning a lot of new things, trying to deal with the coronavirus pandemic and keep myself from going crazy, and also serve the people that I care so much about. And I just apologize while I kind of get things adjusted here. Anyway, welcome to our discussion about dialogue this morning. I suppose I should take a few moments to talk about why I decided not to attend the Writers Fest in person. Just has to be with being of a certain age, being relatively high risk for substantive side effects or difficulties if I do happen to catch this virus. But the thing that was bothering me the most was just having the need to go to Moscow here last week or a couple of weeks ago to do some shopping, and just understanding that people are not understanding the severity of this virus and the importance of wearing masks and protecting other people from themselves. So even though we had made an arrangement for everyone in our session to wear masks, I still felt that there was it was too much of a risk for me and for my family. So I appreciate the fact that you're willing to view the session this way. And Kalela should also have some handouts for you that are meant to supplement today's talk. I'm not sure that I can talk for 75 minutes about dialogue without having you here with me to do some exercises and some other interaction. And the coronavirus was going to make that part difficult anyway, because it's tough to talk to people from 6 feet apart and through a mask and accomplish what we needed to accomplish. So we'll do as much as we can here today. I will just also provide you with my email address. It's coom1286@hotmail.com. And if you have any questions after we're finished today, you are more than welcome to write to me. And if I can't answer your question via email in a short manner, I'll make arrangements to speak with you over the phone. It's very important to me that you get what you need out of this session, despite the circumstances. So that's about the best I can do, is just to make myself available to you. I guess that maybe it would be helpful to provide a little bit of background about myself. One of the reasons I am so concerned about the pandemic is that I spent about 10 years of my life working as an RN in my first career, and 7 years of that were spent as in public health, running public health programs, creating public health departments, specifically with the Indian Health Service. And so I'm and having worked epidemiology, worked in communicable disease, and done quite a number of those investigations. What I know about coronavirus is that this is a situation that we've all been dreading for decades, and that is a fast-moving, easily spreadable, highly contagious, devastating organism that, if we don't keep it at bay, has the potential to wipe out serious ratios of our world population. So that is my beginning. I also have for my entire life been a writer, worked at it my entire life, but it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I realized that life was getting away from me. And if I didn't make a decision to to change my career and change my focus, I was never going to be able to self-actualize and reach my potential. And that is not in any way detrimental to those people who work in nursing. It just was not for me. But I appreciate what I learned, and definitely appreciate what that field taught me about human beings and humanity, which is something I've been able to bring to my writing and to my teaching. And all I can say is that it's served me well on many fronts. So, and bravo to those people who are still working in that field, because I honestly don't know how they do it. Those are tough, smart, capable folks, and we should all be really grateful for them. And the one thing that I love that has come out of this pandemic is the fact that our nurses are finally getting the recognition that they have long, long deserved. So thank you to all of you out there who are defending us and working on our behalf. And I have to tell you that my mother, who lives in a nursing home in North Carolina, tested positive a few months back for coronavirus, and just this week had her celebration for having survived it. So we're really grateful for that today too. All right. Well, let's see. My background as a writer. Some of you may know who I am. I've lived in this region for almost 30 years. I did my MFA in creative writing at the University of Idaho. I was in that very first class, and was one of two people to receive that degree first in the state of Idaho. And I like to say that, technically speaking, because my name starts with a C and the other guy's name started with an S, that I was the first one to receive it. But he walked and I didn't. I didn't attend graduation, so I guess we have to give that honor to him. At any rate, I've been teaching writing for this entire time. So beginning in 1997, 23 years of teaching writing. I spent a total of 3 years at University of Idaho doing that degree, and then moved over to the Washington State University and taught there in 2 stints for a total of 14 years. I also taught for Blue Mountain Community College through the Friday College program at Fish Trap in Enterprise, and actually one semester traveled over to Antioch University in Seattle and taught a course there. Meantime, I've also taught many workshops, many conferences. I've taught creative writing at the Idaho Youth Challenge Academy, which was a fabulous experience. I have have been for the last 7 years running a retreat program in conjunction with Reflections Inn up on the Clearwater River. And we have had, I believe we've sponsored 22 retreats, either for groups of writers or individual writers who are there just consulting with me on a manuscript. So I also coach authors in the writing of their books. Right now I have four writers I'm working with individually, and I assist them through the entire process from drafting through publication and learning the ropes in promotions and marketing. Some of you may know that getting a book published doesn't mean that it's going to come with a big marketing budget. So we're left to fend for ourselves in that regard, especially those of us who have work being published out of the small independent presses, which is the case with me. I love the world of independent publishers and extol the benefits of staying with the independents. You might get more airtime if you go with the big five, or if you go with a New York house or some of the bigger independent presses. But for my money, you don't get as personalized a focus as you do with the small independent presses, and you don't really have as much control over what happens with your book either. So that's my little spiel on the world of publishing. But we're here today to talk about dialogue. And dialogue is probably the most difficult thing about writing. Getting genuine dialogue down on the page is an issue for a lot of writers, and I know throughout my 23 years of working with creative writers, that probably has been the question that I've been faced with most often is, how do you do believable dialogue? Um, there is one answer for that, and it's an answer that most of us don't want to hear, and that is you have to do a lot of homework, a lot of preparatory work, and a lot of pre-writing before you can ever even start to think about giving someone voice or giving someone a voice. So let's just sort of start with not even thinking about having a draft of something, but let's say that you are in a English 251, which is the introduction to creative writing at WSU, and we're going to talk about dialogue. And what probably the very first exercise I would have you do is an exercise in basically in eavesdropping. So what I do in class is I set up a couple of people to have a conversation, and then I set up a circle of people with their backs to those folks, and the people on the outside circle are supposed to record whatever it is that the speaking couple, the dialogue couple, is talking about. And I usually give some kind of a prompt for those two people to be so they have something to discuss. So they're not just sitting there making something up. So there has to be a little bit of acting that goes on. So if we were in session today and there was no coronavirus, we would have out of 18 people, we would probably have 2 or 3 separate groups where I have a couple in the middle, and then I have folks on the outside who are listening and recording whatever it is they're talking about. So we're talking about learning how to eavesdrop. So since we can't do it in class, and since we have coronavirus, it makes this exercise a little more difficult, because the second thing I'm going to ask you to do is to go sit in a coffee shop or go sit in a restaurant, say a quick food place, and record whatever you hear people saying. So you literally position yourself in to eavesdrop on people. And I'll tell you that this exercise comes from experience that I had early in my nursing education, where we went to nursing homes and had conversations with one of the residents that were meant to be sort of therapeutic. So our goal was to draw information out of that client. So just in sort of a casual style conversation, to try to get some get history from that client or that resident, or to get some subjective information about how they're feeling, how they're doing that day. So I translated that little exercise then into this idea of teaching people to eavesdrop, and I have to tell you, it works. It's really the fastest way to figure out or to learn how we really speak. What happens often in dialogue, in early drafts for people, is that the speech comes across as sort of Hollywoodized or stock. It doesn't sound like a real person with a real person's idiosyncrasies. So what I try to get people to do is to train themselves to listen. We already know that the best way to learn to write is to read what other people have written. Well, dialogue just falls in that same kind of vein, and that is that the best way to learn to write it is to listen to people speaking. And this is not only good practice for writing, this is good practice for living. Because I know you know what this feels like when you're talking to somebody, and it feels like you sort of get the sense that they're not really paying attention. And the truth is, and this has been studied and well documented, most of us, when we are listening, are not listening to not really listening to what's being said. We're not hearing what's being said. we're thinking about what we're going to say next in response to whatever conversation is going on. This is a habit that you can break. Everybody knows about brain plasticity. Everybody knows that the brain is malleable and changeable. And this is one place where you can make that really evident, is that you just sort of put yourself in the mindset of, oh, I recognize this. I understand this. Whenever somebody's talking, that's what I do. I'm thinking about what I'm going to say next. I'm not really hearing what that person is going to say. And once you recognize that about yourself and focus on really listening to what somebody is saying when they're talking to you, hearing the words, letting the words go in, letting the words shape meaning in your mind, you get used to doing that, and you're going to turn yourself into a good listener, number one. But number two, you're going to have no problem writing idiosyncratic dialogue when it comes to doing fiction or creative nonfiction. So that is like the number one biggest trick. And we all, I know we all kind of hate this. We hate the prep work. We hate none of us likes to do homework. And I think every time I talk about this subject, I realize that what I'm telling people is that you have to do your homework. Well, it turns out that you have to do your homework no matter what phase of writing you're in, no matter what kind of writing you're doing. You have to do prep work. You have to do pre-writing. You have to do brainstorming and mind mapping and all that stuff. And so this is the homework. This is the prep work. This is the equivalent of running sprints if you're going to play football, or doing scales if you're going to play the piano, for being able to write good dialogue. So that should be number one on your list. Start listening to and start writing down, start recording on a piece of paper in a notebook dialogue that you hear, that you overhear, and listen for the patterns and the rhythms in people's speech. If you were to sit here today and try to translate what I'm saying to you, you would notice that I do a lot of pausing when I talk. I like to stop and think for a moment, make sure what's coming out makes sense. I'm getting kind of older, so my memory isn't as great as it used to be. So I want to make sure that I'm not duplicating myself or losing my train of thought or whatever, which happens. It'll probably happen today before we get finished. But anyway, that is like it is just the way to get yourself started down the road to writing believable and true voice, what I like to call true voice dialogue. So that's number one. I recommend doing this for a period of time, weeks, days, months even, until you have yourself trained to truly listen and recognize the distinguishing patterns in the speech of various people. So it's not going to work to just do it once. It's not going to work to just go today to Starbucks and write down whatever the person in the drive-thru says to you. That's not going to do it. You really are going to have to spend some time practicing this part of it. We have our speech is informed by where we come from, where we live. My family comes from the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky, but I'm guessing you would never know that by listening to me right now. I sound very Western. I've been living out west for 40 years, so it makes sense, actually more than 40 years now. So it makes sense that my dialogue has changed. But when you listen to my brother, when you listen to my baby brother, he sounds a whole lot different than I do, but he's been living in North Carolina all these years. And when I go to North Carolina and I spend time with him and my mother and my other family members who are still living down there, I start sounding just exactly like him. And you can't tell that I ever spend a day out west. You can't tell that I have any other background than those hills, those Blue Ridge mountain ranges, those valleys and clefts, and why you would think I'd been living down there my whole life. Did you hear that? Did you hear all that? I just completely changed the cadence of my speech. Am I still me? Am I still myself? Yeah, I haven't changed. But I can be a little bit malleable when it comes to that Southern style speech. And we didn't come out of North Carolina in any recent time. A decade or 100 years back, we had people come out, but most of our people were in Kentucky and in the hills and the mountains of Kentucky, and their speech sounds nothing like what I just did, and it doesn't really sound like what my brother's doing does either. But I can't even replicate what they do. It's so connected to the old Celt way of speaking. So that's the other thing that you can study is not just listening to people's voices kind of ad lib out in the world, but listening to recorded voices. And my goodness, there's billions, trillions of opportunities to do that today. There are these wonderful features on the internet even that will tell you how to pronunciate words, or take you to different dialects so that you can listen to those dialects. So just do some Googling around that wonderful malleable verb that we now have available to us, and see what you can find. Listen for different inflections, for different speech patterns. One thing I love to do is just strike up conversations with people. So this is the other thing you can do. And if you're a real introvert, this might be harder for you. I'm kind of lucky in that way, in that I am an extreme introvert on one hand, but on the other hand, I need public engagement too. So it's kind of 50-50 for me. And I love talking to the people of the world. I love finding out about the everyday people. You can have all the celebrities you want. I want the folks who live in small towns and back roads, and I want to know about them. I want to know what they sound like. And so everywhere I go, in fact, my husband kind of makes fun of me because, I can't just walk into the gas station and pay $20 for the gas I'm about to put in the pump. I'm going to find out something about that person behind the counter. It does a couple of things. It humanizes people. And especially in this era that we are living in, when you wonder what has happened to everybody's humanity, I'm including myself. I mean, it's just the strangest period of time I've lived through in 63 years. But people feel disconnected. People feel isolated, and so by just doing that one thing of striking up conversation with somebody, or complimenting on them, haircut or glasses or shirt or whatever, anything that you can think of to connect with that person on a human basis, and listen to the way they speak to you, coming back to you. You start doing enough of that, and you just get your ear trained to this thing that we call idiosyncratic speech patterns, and we all know about voice recognition. We know that our voices are kind of like our fingerprints. And so when you think of that detail and think of it at that level, then you get an idea of the kind of detail that you need to be able to draw into your dialogue. Well, what what does that amount to? What's the bottom line there? The bottom line is knowing who your character is. And so that's where I want to focus most of my discussion today. And you'll notice that the handouts are very focused on that too. That is helping you to learn who your character is, because who that person is, where they come from, and where their family is from, who they're surrounded with, and education, all those things are going to inform what that person is going to sound like, what their language is going to sound like. So it starts then. On the one hand, I'm sending you out in the world and telling you to listen to people, but on the other hand, I'm going to sit you down at your desk, and I'm going to set you down with two things. I'm going to set you down with a notebook and a pencil, and I'm going to set you down with a sketch pad, because the first thing I want you to do is try to draw your character. Now, I'm not that great of an artist. I'm certainly not a realist, and so for me to render somebody fully in a sketch is not necessarily a pretty thing. But what it does is to get me to thinking about who that person really is from the cells up. What does that person look like? What do they look like in my mind? And I spend some time with this. With every character in every book, I spend time in my sketchbook trying to get an understanding of the physicality of that person. Now, sometimes that changes over the course of writing a short story or a character featuring a particular, or I'm sorry, a short story or a novel featuring a particular character, but but starting at that at least makes you, it just takes you into into a deeper level, trying to understand humanity in a person doesn't do much good if you don't have any clues as to who that person actually is. And so starting with trying to actually give physicality to them, to me, makes a whole lot of sense. And I just have to tell you, it's has worked for me, because the one thing I get accused of more than anything in my fiction writing is that things are too real. And I have had people doubt that my fiction is even fiction. I get no credit for having a good imagination or having put in a lot of really, really hard work and years of labor. People want to think I'm just writing from my life, and the truth is, it's all made up, and for the most part. And we'll talk a little bit about assemblage art, or assemblage. I'm not a very good speaker of French, but we'll talk a little bit about that later on, and how I end up constructing fiction with bits and pieces from actual existence. But that's a separate thing from writing fiction that's sort of based on your own life. So anyway, you start with this exercise of trying to sketch the person out. And I really emphasize focusing on one character at a time. So start with your protagonist, or start with one of your other secondary characters, but think about spending at least maybe a week of your life focused on just that one person. If it's your protagonist, you might want to think about, even spending more time than that, a couple of weeks. For myself, I spend a long time thinking about a person and sketching and trying to map out who they are before I ever even think about putting them on the page and putting them in a situation where they have to respond to something. So I do the sketching part, and trying to draw them out. And then the second thing I do is a full-on character sketch that lists every possible detail of that person. Excuse me. Pardon me. I'm sorry, that's not coronavirus. That's me trying to breathe and talk and swallow at the same time. Okay. So a character sketch, and this is one of the things that I'm going to send you, because I feel like these two things I'm going to talk about next are as important, if not more important, than anything else we're going to talk about today. The character sketch is a detailed analysis of a person. It tells you everything from that person's date of birth, sign of the zodiac, and I'll just have to tell you, for many years, before, the first thing I would do when I was trying to figure out a character and to try to render them was to assign them a birthday and the accompanying zodiac sign, and then I have this big book called Personologies. These two men, I'm not going to be able to think of their names right now, but the book is easy to find. It's a huge encyclopedic, inches thick kind of deal. And what they did is to study 15, I think they did inventories with 15,000 different people, or 25,000, an enormous number. and categorize them according to day of the year that they were born. They did some tarot, they did some numerology, they did a bunch of other, astrological studies and that kind of thing, and came up with a list of characteristics, personality characteristics that they saw over and over and over again based on the day of the year that that person was born. It's a fascinating book. And if you know the Richie Havens song, he insists that there's only 13 different kinds of people, and and this book sort of has that same opinion. But I happen to not think so. I think, if we've got 6.2 billion people on the planet, we've got 6.2 billion types of people. And I have to believe that way. Otherwise, I'm not going to create idiosyncratic characters, and which is always my goal. So the personology book was a great place as a young writer. Early in my writing career, that was a great place to go to get clues about what a personality might be like. Now these days, after I've written 10 books, eight are published, one's in the pipeline, and one's being finished, being edited, and I in these days, these later days, it is true that people tend to give themselves to me kind of a whole. So I'll have an idea for a character, and boy, it takes nothing to sit down and write out that character sketch, because they're fully formed in my mind before, almost right away. Now, in times past, I would like take a newspaper clipping. I would see a picture of somebody in an article or something that would interest me, or just see a face somewhere that that stuck with me, and then I would start trying to construct the personality for that person. I believe that it's because of this habit I have of trying to render people, trying to understand people before I put them on the page. I believe that after 23 years of that, or so, that's why people tend to come to mind fully formed, and my knowledge and awareness of them is fully formed. So brain plasticity, I've retrained my brain in this way. But I still do the work. I still do the work of sketching them, drawing them, and sketching them out in words, getting those details on the page. Because, well, for one thing, sometimes you forget. I mean, if you've been working on a book, on a novel, on a manuscript for 5 or 6 years, you might forget what you originally decided was their favorite color, or what they had hidden in the shoebox in the back of their closet, or how many dust bunnies were under the bed. You might have you might not be able to remember that stuff. So you record all those details so that you have it to refer back to too, so that you've got some consistency in your storytelling and your rendering of that character. So the list that you're going to get from me for all the details that you should put down for your character is quite long. So we start with the birthday and the horoscope. No harm in that. If you can find a book of personologies, I think it's a great place to start with those idiosyncratic details of character. Some of what we are comes from nature. Some of it comes from nurture. Some of it comes from the damage that's been bestowed on us because of choices we made. we get formed by so many different things. I mean, we come out these little lumps of clay, and stuff happens to us and changes us. But I think when you're a young writer, if you're just getting started in writing, we call you a young writer, no matter how old you are. So if you're a young writer, it's just a good place to start until you've really kind of trained yourself to be able to conjure people without having them be based on somebody's book of personalities. It's just a nice little training tool, and just fascinating. By the way, I have to say that that book just had me pegged. Exactly. That's probably why I fell in love with it, and also it had all my exes pegged too. So Anyway, made me a believer. Anyway, so the list of things that I'm going to recommend that you put down, starting as I said with birthday, is familial background. So where does this person come from? I'm heavily informed by my Appalachian heritage and my mixed race parentage, and I'm I mean the smells I grew up with and the sounds. Both sets of grandparents living in these sort of well, these mountain situations, and they were farmers, raised cane, raised tobacco, sugar cane, not not the kind of cane you might be thinking of, tobacco, subsistence farming, raised enough chickens and pigs and cows to keep everybody fed. It was so I when I think about my childhood, I think about this just mostly the smells, all those different smells that come from the day-to-day activities of trying to keep food on the table and to keep a farm going. Your character might come from the city. Your character might be urban. Might have come from generations and generations of people who've lived in urban settings. So that those characters are harder for me. I admit that I do tend to write about rural people and specifically rural women because that is what I know the most. And that's what I know the best. And you're going to hear this in your training as a writer at some point, that you should write what you know. Well, we all have different interpretations of that, but the thing I've learned after all these many years is that it makes sense to tell the stories from your own existence. And that's going to make dialogue easier for you too, because your characters are going to have the voices, the kind of voices, the cadence to those voices that you're used to hearing. So it's going to just make things that much simpler for you. It took me a long time to learn that. For many years, I was beset with the idea that I wanted to bring to life my native grandparents and my African American great grandparents um, and what I've learned recently is that I can't do that. I don't look like any of those people, and we know that we live in a racist world. And if you're a dark-skinned person, your experience is quite different from somebody who looks like me. And so we're all now learning about our white privilege. So if you're a light-skinned person, and then it's going to be your duty to render light-skinned characters especially when you're speaking from the first person. That's not to say that you can never have somebody who doesn't look like you in your book, but you cannot try to render that person's experience. That makes the dialogue issue so much simpler if you're not trying to render the speech patterns of a culture that doesn't belong to you, that you're not part of. And we've said that speech is very much informed by those people around us, how the way those people talk. We're all around here familiar with kind of the Western twang. We hear that in people's speech and people's voices all the time. It's a certain tonal quality. So isn't it interesting how all these things work together? So you see how it's not possible just to sit down and give you some instructions for rendering dialogue. It is much more complicated than that. Dialogue is almost the frosting on the cake. So you've got to do the mixing and the baking. You've got to do everything else before you even get to the point of rendering dialogue. So that's why we start with these character sketches, both physical and on the page. So you have to have an exploration of family history. You have to understand who that person is. I am right now I'm in my note taking and research phase for my next novel, and it's set in Kentucky, where my family came from, and where I spent my weekends and time in the summer when I was a kid. And you would think that I would know those people inside and out, but my main character is a very complicated young woman. She's complicated racially. She's complicated because she's basically a feminist with in a place where in a time during the Vietnam War when feminism in the mountains of Kentucky meant something completely different than what it means to us now, and when you're in a situation where your life is all about subsistence, when you're trying to raise and produce enough food to last your family through the winter, you don't have time to think about who uh, who's in charge. You don't think have time to think about who rules. You don't have time to think about such things as I don't want to say this wrong, but in the world I came from, everybody was more or less equal because everybody had a job to do. Everybody had to do their job. Was there abuse? Yes, there was abuse. Was it often against the women? Yes, it was. But there wasn't a woman that I can think of who wasn't aware of her own power, just because over the course of living like that you find your own power within yourself, or you cease to exist. You can't even do your job. And I'm getting into really complicated territory here that I don't really want to go to, but all of this is kind of wrapped up in that original edict for doing your character sketch, and that is that you have to fully understand your familial background of your character, and you need to get that written down and details of it on a notebook page before you ever even start to draft. You need to know what your client your character's education level is. What kind of student were they? I mean, our educational background is going to affect our speech. Do they say ain't? Um, do they do they speak in parables and riddles? I've known people like that. Do they quip often? We certainly have all known people like that. People who turn everything into a joke. Um, a lot of this is based on worldview. But it's also based on level of education. So your diction, the level of language that a character uses is going to probably be pretty closely connected to their education level and the education level of the people around them. I know that when I was still teaching, I used a whole lot more 4 and 5 syllable words than I tend to do now. What's the use? Um, I, I, I I think in my writing, because my characters tend to be rural, and speech tends to be a little more simple. Word choice tends to, we just, I don't know who has the time for a 25-cent word, as Mark Twain called them. We just lean towards simpler speech. That's a generalization, I suppose, but that's what I see and that's what I hear. So my characters speak pretty plainly. I have to be careful of my narration, that my own education level doesn't impact that too much. Um, I'm kind of tiptoeing around this subject because I don't want to insult anybody, but I think it is. And certainly I've known people who, without formal educations, who are very articulate, and I mean, we all know that too. And we all know people who love big flamboyant words that leave the rest of us guessing. So, some of those things are personality, but also influenced by whatever the education level is of that person and the familial background. Um, let's see. You also want to have an understanding, excuse me, of your character's habits. Um, are they tidy? Are they clean? Are they sloppy? Are they hoarders? Are they all these personal habits of day-to-day living have an impact on dialogue too, because these these things, I think they're representative of people's mental status. We speak differently when we're sad, I think, or when we're happy, or when we're depressed, or when we're at, excited or when we're ecstatic, when we're in love. When I talk about my husband, I've been on this house project now for a long time, and when I talk about contractors and subcontractors, I use very foul language and very angry speech because I've learned something about a segment of society that I didn't know much about, even though my father was a builder and a contractor. But so it just, and once again, this is something about my background that's affecting the way I'm talking about other people. It's affecting my word choice because I come from a background with a father who was in construction and a superintendent over dozens of people, and but he was somebody who was very fair and meticulous and something of a perfectionist. And so I came to expect a certain quality of work from people in the trades. And what we've learned from having been through this experience of trying to build a house, we've learned that these characteristics are not consistent across the trades. So the language that I've learned in this last year and a half features a lot of angry tones because of the situations that we've lived through. But I don't think I would have that anger. I wouldn't have those angry words if I hadn't had the familial experience of family who were very dedicated and very meticulous about their work. So that's a little bit complicated, but I hope I'm making myself clear that what I've grown up with affects the way I see and perceive this situation, which affects my word choice. So if I were the character that you were developing and you were doing that written character sketch of me, it would be very important that you talked about the fact that my father was a construction superintendent over many dozens of people, and that he was a fair and righteous individual. So understanding the parents, the nuclear family, if such a thing exists, understanding all that about your character also helps you to understand how they speak, where their language acquisition originated. It originated from those people who brought them into the world and raised them, whoever those people are. So you have to understand all that. Understanding a character's relationship with self, understanding the character environment, getting all that down. All of these things inform language. Every aspect of our daily lives informs the way we speak, and every aspect of our background informs our daily speech. So understanding that is like probably the most important thing to understanding character dialogue. And that is that you just cannot accomplish anything with dialogue until you fully understand who the person is. And again, the handout that you get has an enormous list of all the details that you should consider before you start creating this person on the page. The second piece I have for you, you're actually, I think, with the dialogue, you're going to get something about setting too. Because I recommend doing an equal amount of work on setting because of the impact that setting has and environment has on the way we speak. And everything from inflections and tonal qualities and colloquialisms to worldview, frankly. I often think about people the difference in the way people see the world, depending on whether they live in valleys and canyons or whether you live on a hill and can see out. These situations affect our worldview, and therefore they affect the way we speak and the way we think. You can take my word for that, or you can do research on that yourself. This is something else that's very well proven. The other thing once you've done that, all of this homework I've given you so far, there's another piece that's probably going to be the difference between you really understanding the language and the inner thoughts of your character and not. And I will tell you that of the people I know who have used this technique, they have raved about it, just raved about it. And that is this notion of doing character diaries. Yeah. How do you do that? Well, you spend about a week of your time every day, and even 2 weeks if if you really have somebody who's tough to understand, every single day, writing in a diary as if you are that person. So from the point of view of your character, spend a week to 2 weeks every single day writing in that person's voice in a daily diary. So that person keeping track of whatever is going on in their life at that time. And this is not wasted effort, because often what will happen is that you'll think of scene possibilities or other details that you would not have come up with otherwise if you hadn't spent this focused time. So this is the absolute tried and true last keystone piece for learning to write idiosyncratic dialogue, and that is spending some time writing basically fake diary entries, but writing diary entries for that character in that voice of that character as if that is who you are. So you're talking about taking on a character as an actor would. You're talking about pulling in method acting kinds of exercise into your writing practice. And this has worked for me over and over again. I to be honest, I came upon the idea when I was writing my first novel, which was called Dove Creek, and I promised you that we would talk about assemblage art, and this is where that's going to happen. Dove Creek was a novel that started out to be a memoir. I had a problem in that memoir in that I couldn't capture my own voice, but there was another voice that kept pushing its way to the surface. And I finally gave in to that voice and spent some time writing in that woman's voice. And her name was Patricia Faye Morrison. She was from not the same part of Kentucky that my family was from, but from much deeper in the mountains. Had a much harder life than what I did and what my family did. But it was in the writing of those diary entries for her that I realized that, what I really wanted to do was include as part of the novel a portion of her diary. And so I ended up having her take a cross country trip on a bus, which I did myself, I think not once but 4 times. It's really hard on the body, let me tell you. At the time I was in my 40s, riding bus cross country is not the same as when you were 20. But I think I did 4 trips back and forth to be able to write that section, and in her voice. And I did write that section really early in the drafting of the book, so I learned much about her voice, which was very confusing because here I was trying to write a memoir, and it just wasn't happening. It completely wasn't happening, and I didn't understand the story at all until I latched on to Patricia Faye's voice during the writing of these diaries from her point of view. So when I say assemblage, then, or assemblage art, let's just use the American pronunciation for the sake of whatever clarity, I don't know. But so what assemblage art does, I'm trying to get my hands free here because I have to talk with my hands, but what assemblage art does is to pick up bits and pieces here and there, found pieces a lot of times, and put them together to make a whole, a piece of art. So in writing, what I do then is I kind of decorate my stories with bits and pieces of things that I see and observe in the world, or that I go out looking for. So, for example, in Dove Creek, when I made all those trips back and forth so that I could write those journal entries for Patricia Fay, I was also picking up bits and pieces of what I was seeing and experiencing as I did that travel. So for me, it's all about found bits and pieces, and it's all about going out and having experiences for the sake of incorporating it into the writing. This is nothing unique. People do this all the time. But a lot of folks, I think early on as writers, they think, oh, it's all going to come from my imagination, and I don't have any I don't feel inspired, and so I don't know if I can tell this story. Well, let me let you off the hook, because it doesn't all have to come from your imagination. You can go out and get bits and pieces to incorporate into the story that bring a certain level of reality to it. And so dialogue works the same way. You can overhear something, a phrase or a word or a pattern of speech or something, and you're like, oh, I have to use that. This is why we always carry a notebook, or if you've worked with me, you know about my 4x6 card file system. You always keep those 4x6 cards with you, and you hear something like that and you jot it down, because if you don't write it down, you lose it. So this is kind of the other clue, and that is to be alert in the world, listening for pieces of dialogue that might actually be suitable for your character, that might be something that your character would say. So that is the probably the hardest part, are these character diaries. But you want to think about the time frame of your book or your story. You want that character to be writing about their experience in those diaries from inside whatever that time frame is. And so it becomes kind of inside the world of the book. It's like a real time record of whatever's going on with that character. You probably will never use any of the information that you put down, or you may. What as I said earlier, what may come to you are scenes or details, or even idiosyncrasies that you wouldn't have thought out of before if you hadn't been so deep inside that character's brain. So it's a powerful exercise, and as I've said, it smacks of homework, yes, but what it brings, the fullness that it will bring to your writing will be noticeable. So what I'm talking about doing here is spending at least a full month just on your protagonist before you ever even start thinking about details of plot. And somebody who works with me as a book coach, this is what we do. This is where we go from day one. This is what we spend our time doing. And if you get stuck, if you feel like you don't know where your plot is going to go, you feel like you don't know what's going to happen next, then you turn back to these methods. So go back to sketching. Try to sketch out the scene. Try to go back into your character sketch and mine for details, or see if there's some little detail that comes to you that you didn't think of the first time around. Go back to the character diaries. If you find this is like the absolute best thing that you can do. If you find yourself unable to move forward in your book or your story, go back to writing in your character voice in their diaries and see what happens there. And you'll find it. You'll find the pearl that you're looking for. All of this stuff takes time, and time is your best friend. Time is the friend of the writer. So don't worry about how much time you're taking. All of my books have taken enormous amount of time. I worked from beginning to end. I worked on Dove Creek for 15 years. I published other books in that time, yes. And but you know, I just don't think about those years. It was and anytime you're engaged in creative process like that, time just kind of ceases to matter anyway. And I always feel like a book or a story has its own time and its own timing, and it doesn't fully come to fruition until it is done with us. I just used this language yesterday when speaking to somebody. You know, a book isn't done until it's done with you. So I hope all these things help you. Dialogue is, as I said, very hard to do and to do well. But if you do this background work, I can pretty much guarantee that you're going to have idiosyncratic dialogue with your character. Um, just one other last little thing. We just hit the hour mark here, and I feel like that's long enough for anybody to sit and listen to something. So I'm going to wrap up here. But this has to do with attribution. Attribution is that sort of he said, she said that goes along with dialogue. And what we've gotten to a point here where current style sort of dictates that we use as little attribution as possible. That means that your line of dialogue has to be idiosyncratic enough to that character, to the individual character, that there's no doubt about who is speaking. So there's even more pressure on us now to deliver dialogue that unmistakably belongs to a particular character. And how do you do that? Well, by all these techniques that we've talked about here today. So again, thank you for being here and for joining me. I hope that I've brought you something that you can use that will be valuable to you. And once again, also, if you want to reach out, if you have questions, my email address is COOM, as in Martin, 1286 @hotmail.com. And if you'd like to look me up online, I have a web address, www.paulamariecoomer.com. Thank you very much.